In this nugget, we continue group policy with part 3, where we discuss scope of management, also known as the order of inheritance. And this is how you can tell what policies will apply, because very often you'll have many policies that apply to a given user or computer. It's important to understand if any of them will override or take precedence over another one. Also, we'll take a look at policies versus preferences. Preferences are something that's relatively new. It's something that we didn't always have in previous versions of Active Directory. Before, we'd have only policies. These open up a whole new world of additional settings, which can be very useful. We also will take a look here at starter GPOs, which are kind of a template way of creating new group policy objects. All right, let's take a look at another policy here, but this time for the computer side of things, just to have something else to work with. Now, what I'm going to do in this case is I'm going to disable in-private filtering. Now, what's that about? In-private filtering disables the ability to track your internet history, certain kinds of cookies and other form data, things like that. In other words, it's a good way to cover your tracks. Not that I've ever used it. Well, maybe a little bit here and there, but not very often, or not every day anyway. Okay, anyway, so let's take a look at this in-private policy. And what I'm going to do with this one is I've already created it and named it here, but I haven't actually set the policy here. So I'm going to go ahead and choose Edit, and I'm going to go up to the computer side of things, where we go under Administrative Templates, Windows Components, Internet Explorer, and then down here to Privacy. It's kind of hard to see. Let me expand that a little bit. There we go. And then what we have here is this turn off in private browsing, and it kind of describes it again over here, you know, cookies, temporary internet files history, other kinds of data, so that if someone were to go back through and look at your internet history, they would not see what you've been doing all day, you know, shopping on Amazon or something like that. Let's say that. Okay, so we'll enable turn off in private browsing, and we'll click OK. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to close this up, and I'm going to link this to the Tucson desktops where I've got my Windows 8 computer. And now let's go ahead and see if we can use in private browsing there. So to begin with, I don't think that policy's refreshed yet over here on my Windows 8 client computer. So as I go on down through here, you know, we can see that we are able to access the CBT Nuggets website. Maybe we don't really want people to know that we're on this website, because we don't want our coworkers to know that we're getting smarter than them every day by watching CBT Nuggets videos. So what we might do is, you can use a keyboard shortcut for this, but if you go into your if you go into Safety and then choose in private browsing, the keyboard shortcut's Control-Shift-P, and then we open this up, then we can see we are now able to access this through in private browsing. So I might close up that original item there, and now I could go to CBT Nuggets or wherever it is that I wanted to go. And when I close this up, you know, let's go to another site. Let's go to my own website, www.myworld.com, hisearthmyworld.com. Maybe I wouldn't want people to know that I've been to this website in you know, in my spare time, so to speak, at work. So now watch what happens when I close this up and I go back into a normal browser. Okay, not a private one, but just a normal one. If we take a look at the internet history here, notice that we don't see anything there relating to His Earth My World. We do see this one because we browsed that before we went to private browsing, but hisearthmyworld.com does not show up there. By the way, I'm not trying to promote my personal website, hisearthmyworld.com. I just want you to know that it's out there, His Earth My World. Okay, anyway, so as we see that, you know, we've got that kind of in private browsing going on, maybe that's causing some HR issues. You know, a lot of organizations really don't like the users to use that in private browsing, and so they might want to turn off in private browsing, and that's why they might link it to their Tucson desktops or whatever. They want to turn that ability off. So as I go back over here, let's just go ahead and refresh our policy. I'm going to go to a run line here and a GP update. And because this computer is in the organizational unit where I linked that policy, let's just review that real quick while I'm doing this. Because it's in this organizational unit, then it's going to see this policy apply to it. Okay. Now, if I had lots of time, I would also have just done this, right-click, chosen refresh, like you saw me do in our last nugget. But since I'm trying to quickly teach this, I'm just going to go ahead and try to, you know, jump the gun a little bit and run GP update. And then now, having run GP update, we just go to you know, the default home page here for Internet Explorer. Oh, hey, look, he's exiting American Idol. Well, it's about time, I tell you. Now, there's another art. Oh, hey, I might click on. You know what, though? Maybe I should turn on in private browsing first. So I'm just going to go over here to Safety and choose the in private browsing. Gee, it used to be there. Is that where it was? Oh, that's right. They put that policy down on me, so I can't hide my browsing habits anymore. Doggone it. Well, anyway, so you see, that's what in private browsing would have done for us. But on a corporate level, we said, no, 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 and we wagged our finger back and forth, or we did a little Z-snap, or something like that. And so now they can't access any in private browsing. So then this takes us to a very important discussion about what we call the scope of management. Some people call it the order of inheritance. But this relates to how group policies apply, the order that they apply in, what happens if they conflict with one another. Because most organizations, you're going to have dozens, sometimes hundreds of group policies that could potentially apply to a user or computer. This is very important to know about, not only for exam purposes, and by the way, I think this will probably apply to just about any Microsoft exam you take where there's group policies involved. Okay, so you got to know this. Also, for practical reasons, it's very important. You might apply a policy to a specific OU, for example, and the next day your boss calls you and says, hey, that policy you told me you did, nothing's happening. What's going on here? Well, you have to know where to link it properly, or else it's not going to have any effect. Or worse yet, you might link it to the wrong place, and it affects the wrong people, or potentially an entire company. And you might have turned off something that the entire company needs, and that's subject for great embarrassment or possibly a resume writing event. So you got to be very careful about this. Now, generally speaking, for any user configuration settings that we configure, we will usually link those policies where we have a user configuration setting to a user's organizational unit. Now, of course, you can link a group policy to a site domain or an organizational unit. Most of the time, though, it goes to an OU, so that's why I put that up there. So the key thing to keep in mind there is if I configure a policy under user configuration, it will not do me any good to link it to an OU that contains computers only. Okay, it won't affect any users because there's no users in that OU. Likewise, if I have a computer configuration setting, I must link it to, again, a site domain or organizational unit, but usually it's going to be a computer organizational unit. If there's only users in the organizational unit where I link the computer configuration policy, nothing happens. Okay? Now, normally we also will split these up. And you can see that in my kind of hierarchy here for my fictional company here, where I've got in Tucson, I've got computers in laptops, computers in servers, computers in desktops, and I don't mix the two. I don't put users in servers and laptops and desktops. I only put machines there. Likewise, I don't put computers in the Tucson users organizational unit, only users. Tucson admins, only users. Okay. Now, in some very small organizations, where I've got a small insurance agency of a dozen users, yeah, I might put both in the same OU because there's not that much to manage there. That's what I'm saying over here. But in most corporate environments, medium to larger organizations especially, rarely, if ever, do you see the two in one. And if you do see them both in the same one, very likely there needs to be a design change to what's going on there. So now let's take a look at what we've got so far, and we'll look at it by way of example over here as we look at where group policy applies when you link it to the appropriate organizational unit. So let's go to our domain controller here. And again, here you can see I've created a new policy that prevents changing of the desktop background. And if I go into our policy settings here under administrative templates and then go down to control panel and then personalization, you can see that I've added a new policy here to prevent changing of the desktop background. Okay, we've got maybe a corporate wallpaper back there for the background. You have to have that. We don't allow free speech in our organization, so it's fine, you're stuck with it. So as we go to our, let me close this up here, minimize it. As we take a look at it, we can see that we have a few policies going on by now. We've got the one linked to the domain for hide clock. We've got the one linked to Tucson for prevent changing background. Now, who's that going to apply to? Not only any accounts that are in the Tucson OU, if there were any, but also any of the children. So Tucson admins, where I've got users, they can't change their background. Tucson users down here, they can't change their background either. Now let's go ahead and take a look at this, and we're going to also see where it takes a left turn and goes wrong in the way I've configured this here in a moment. Okay, so we go over to this. No, I guess there's no sense in having this open anymore since there's no private browsing. Anyway, we see that we've got this desktop background here. We might change that in a moment, but there's no clock. Okay, if we did go back to our browser, remember there's no way that we can go into in private browsing. Okay, that's all killed now, so there's no sense in doing that anymore. If I try to change my desktop background, I go to personalize, and I go to the desktop background, and it kind of looks like I can change it. I thought I wasn't supposed to change it. Well, looks like I can. So I'll cancel this for the time being and close this up. What's going on here? A misconfiguration. This was what I was talking to you about in how important it is to make sure that you know the order of inheritance or the scope of management and that you link things to the proper location. Why am I saying that? Look where prevent changing background is linked to the Tucson OU. Where is my trainer account that I'm logged on as? That's in the users organizational unit. Okay, so as a result, I will never receive that policy because it's linked to Tucson users. However, if I log on as, say, Tucson user 01 or somebody like that, we should see that policy apply. So then, in order to make that policy work, which is linked to the Tucson organizational unit, I need to use some user account that's in this scope somewhere. I'm going to use Tucson user 01, and I've actually already logged on, as you can see over here, so that when I go to the desktop and try to change the desktop wallpaper here from this wallflower thing, I'm going to right-click on it and choose Personalize. But gee, I can't click on it. I wanted something more masculine, Guns N' Roses wallpaper or, something like that, and I can't seem to get there. So, we're a company of wallflowers, doggone it. We're proud of it. So we're going to stick with that wallpaper. Also observe here, by the way, that multiple group policies often apply because usually you'll have, well, by default, you have at least the default domain policy. That's where your password policy comes from, for example. We'll look at that more closely when we examine security settings in group policy. So the settings are going to be cumulative as long as they don't disagree with one another. We see that here. So we see an accumulation. Let's go back to our policies here. An accumulation where we have the default domain policy that applies to everybody, all my users and computers, plus we get the hide clock, plus we get prevent changing the background, plus we get turning off in private browsing for any of the Tucson desktops. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 policies that apply cumulatively there. And that's one thing to keep in mind, and you kind of got to follow the breadcrumbs, so to speak, every now and then to make sure that you know what's going to go on there. Oh, by the way, it's not really part of the exam, I don't think, but if you ever get a little bit confused, say, man, you can have dozens of policies going on here. Some of them conflict, some of them might have enforced, some of them might have block policy inheritance going on here, and by the time you get to the end of it, you're not quite sure what's applying. One thing you can do there is to go down here to group policy results, and you can go into this and go to the wizard, and I'm not going to exhaust this for the time being, but you simply select a specific computer, and then you can click next and select a specific user, and it'll tell you exactly what policies are going on there. I'm just going to bypass that for the time being because I don't think it's part of the exam, but that just gives you an idea for being able to keep your world a little bit more sane with all of these group policies going on. Oh, heck, I can't leave it alone. Let's just go ahead and run it real quick. Okay, so I'm going to do another computer here, Win8 Client 01. You can also browse for it. And let's just say Tucson User 01 is one of the accounts that I'm working with. And what this does is it creates a HTML, actually it's an XML file that gives me the details of what's going on here with what group policy settings are applying. For example, on the computer side, I have security settings that are applying for my default domain policy. I've also got a computer side setting that's turn off in private browsing. Okay, so we've got that one going on. I also have some denied GPOs. Why are these denied? Well, because these apply to the user side. Okay, so that's why they're denied, because they're not in the proper scope of management. Okay, so we're looking at the computer side. If I scroll back up again, what's it say up there at the top? Computer details, right there at the top. Okay, well, these are user-side group policy objects, so that's why they're denied. However, if we scroll further on down and look at the user details, then we'll see that the applied GPOs are indeed those that are denied earlier for the computer. These do apply because, guess what? I'm a user when I'm logging on as Tucson User 01. Anyway, that gives you a little bit of an idea. There's also an event log that you can look at, which pulls the events from that local machine over there. It tells me whenever a refresh took place and so on. Also, let's take a look at what occurs if we have conflicts between our policies. So, for example, if we have a setting that enables something at a certain level, maybe on the domain level, but it disables it on an organizational unit level further on down. Which one wins? Well, the last policy that's read wins. Also, I don't really have it here, but I probably should have. If there's a conflict between the computer side settings and the user side settings, then the computer side always wins. You see, for example, there's certain Internet Explorer settings that are duplicated on the computer side and the user side. Okay, and if they are in conflict with one another, the computer side will always win. So, by way of example, let's go ahead and take a look at what policies we have in place, and I think I may have switched a couple things around here, so let me review them with you. On the domain level, besides default domain policy, we're hiding the clock. And look at this, we're turning off the in-private computer disabled. What does that mean? Since we've disabled the turn off, that's kind of a double negative, that means they can use in-private computing, okay, in-private Internet Explorer throughout the domain. Except as we go down the hierarchy here, we notice that when we get to Tucson desktops, once again, we've turned off in private computer. That setting is enabled. Let's go ahead and take a look at this another way as well. Let me go back up to the top one. Notice the settings tab here. This is kind of handy as well because sometimes you don't really know where to click in a specific policy, especially if it's not named very well. Well, this tells us that it's disabled turning off in private browsing, which once again means that it has enabled it. Also notice that it's a hyperlink. If you click on it, it gives you an explanation of what that policy means. Then down here for the in private computer settings, we go down here and we see that this one is enabled. So what does that mean? Since this one is read last, it kind of flows downhill, so to speak, if you will. This one's read first. This one's read second, so this one should take precedence. And if I take a look at one of my computers here, here I've logged on to Windows 8 Client, Win8 Client 02, which is part of the Tucson Desktops organizational unit. Okay. Now, with that one, since we had the last policy read, meaning that it disabled in private browsing, then I should not have private browsing, and indeed I don't. Okay. So that is about what I would have expected there. So apparently everybody in my organization can be trusted with in private computer browsing, except for if you're in Tucson. Interesting. Okay, so anyway, we also have a couple of other things. Here we got prevent changing the background. Look at this though. We also have allow changing the background. This means then if I log on as Tucson user 01, whose account is in the OU of Tucson users, that I will not be able to change my background. Again, we can confirm that here. Okay. But if I am a Tucson admins, and I log on as, say, Tucson admin 01, then I should be able to change my background. All right? So let's go ahead and confirm that. And we'll go back over to my client here, and we'll see if we can change the background here. So I'll go to Personalize, and sure enough, it's disabled. Okay? So to review that over here again, why is it disabled? Because I'm a Tucson user 02 who's in this OU, and we're preventing changing of the background. But now here, logging on as Tucson admin 01, we'll see that we should be able to change the background. And while I'm waiting for the profile to load, why should we see that they get the ability to change the background? Because this policy flows down to Tucson admins. Okay? And that's going to allow them to change the background. Since they're not a child of Tucson users under here, they're not subject to the prevent changing background. And so then here I've logged on as that Tucson admin 01. I go to Personalize, and sure enough, you see that we can change the background to something else if we so desire. And then finally, looking at the example here of whether or not the computer will override the user, here I've got turn off in private computer browsing, and you can see it here. So there's no private browsing allowed on the Tucson desktops. On the user side, we've disabled that. Okay. So notice that we're under user configuration. They've disabled turning off, meaning that a user, we would think at least, would be able to use in private browsing. But they should not be able to because this is in conflict with another policy that's going to take place, and that's the computer side settings. The computer side setting always wins. So when I log on as Tucson user 01, for example, I still should not have the ability to use in private browsing. And so here I am. We're just going to take a quick peek at Internet Explorer after having logged on as Tucson user 01. And we go to Safety, and sure enough, we do not have in private browsing enabled. Again, that's because the computer side overrode the user side settings. Also notice the processing order. We've kind of seen this just by way of example all along. But remember, the order in which policies apply will dictate which ones take precedence. Okay, that's where we said, again, multiple settings are cumulative if they don't disagree. With conflicts, the last policy wins. And that's because of the order in which they're applied. The processing order that we see here is the local default settings will apply first. That would be the settings that apply when Windows is just fresh out of the box. And if you can use in private browsing, that's a local default, so you're going to have in private browsing. There's also site policy settings, and then there's domain settings, organizational unit, and sub-organizational units. As you go down the tree here, whichever one is read last in case of a conflict, that's the one that wins. Again, otherwise they all add up together and you get a combination of effects. And by the way, speaking of sites, there's one thing I realized I didn't show you how to link to a site. You can see down here that we've got sites, but there's nothing there by default. You have to go to Show Sites, okay? And then you can just pick your checkboxes here for whichever ones you want. And now once I've got that, then I could go down in here and I could right-click and link an existing GPO, or once again, you can also, drag down to those, okay? So I'm going to link that hide clock thing. So anybody that visits my site, wherever that is, maybe the default first site name is the Phoenix site. Nobody that visits my site will have the clock available. Now, that's kind of an arbitrary setting here. Very often what we'll actually use sites for is for network settings. So for example, if our particular site has a given proxy server that we always use, then anybody who comes into my office will be forced to use that proxy server. All right, now finally let's take a look at security filtering here, and I do want to point something out with that. Remember I talked earlier about blocking policy inheritance and then using enforce to override the blocking and how you should use that very sparingly. Well, similarly, you should use security filtering also very sparingly for a couple of reasons. Number one, it can get very confusing because there's no visible UI difference when you go through all your policies and you look at them. There's no grayed out item, there's no symbol on here, there's nothing like that to identify that you've made specific security changes to one of these policies. So, just by browsing through here, difficult to identify those changes. The other thing is you should be using the organizational unit flow and structure to apply the policies for you in the easiest possible way. If you find yourself making a lot of exceptions to where you use security filtering, which can be used to prevent the application of a policy to a specific user, well, then you're probably overusing it and you don't have a good organizational unit structure, and you need to rethink that. So for example, what we use security filtering for is to make exceptions, generally speaking. Here is a Tucson user, for example, Tucson user 01. Notice that they cannot change their background. Okay, they're prevented from being able to change that background. And you can see here that it applies now to all authenticated users. If we look at the specifics of that, which would appear on the Delegation tab, I can double-click on the authenticated users, or actually go to Advanced, excuse me, go to Advanced, and I can see that authenticated users have both the read, meaning that they read the policy, and there's another special policy permission they have here, apply group policy. So anybody that has read and apply group policy is going to get the effects of that policy. That includes, admins, anybody. All right. Now, what if I want to make an exception for that one special user, my Tucson user 01 account? We want to give them the privilege of being able to put up their own wallpaper. Well, I'll just enter in Tucson user 01 here. That would be one thing I could do. But the problem we have with that, I'm just going to click OK. The problem we have with that is you kind of pigeonhole into only these very specific settings. I don't want that person to edit the settings or to delete or to modify anything. That's really not going to help me any. What I would do instead is I would go to Advanced, click on Add, Tucson user 01, and then once I've found that user here, I might choose to read, but one thing I don't want them to do is to apply group policy. And in fact, I would then deny apply group policy. The reason why I'm choosing deny is because deny always wins, very similar to NTFS permissions. You see, they're still a part of the authenticated users. As a result, they would have apply group policy. But if I choose deny, that always overrides for this specific user here. Okay, so I'm going to click OK there. Are you sure you want to deny? Because that always overrides, and then I click OK. Now let's go ahead and test that out. I'm going to log off and log back on as Tucson user 01 on that machine, and we should see what happens. And then here I have logged off and logged back on. I'm currently logged on. Let's go actually here real quick. You can see I'm on Tucson user 01. And then now notice that also I can again change my background to something else. And so we have that capability now because I used that security filtering that we talked about here. I do want to address another issue here, and that is policies and preferences. We've seen preferences in the UI, and we worked with them when we added a user to the administrator's security group in a previous nugget. However, other than that, we haven't really addressed them much, and they don't appear in the exam objectives specifically. Nevertheless, they're very powerful and useful, so I think we should go ahead and address them. Some things to keep in mind is both of these really are just registry punches. It's just that the policies write to the registry in a location in such a way that they are revertible back to the defaults if you remove the policy. Preferences, not necessarily so. Now, let's take a look at a comparison between these two. With a policy, these are also called managed, okay? Managed policies. When you make a setting, it's permanent for as long as that policy is in effect. For example, if it's a UI item, maybe the UI is grayed out. That would be the case, for example, when we try to change our desktop background and we were prevented from doing so by policy, well, it was grayed out and unavailable. With preferences, or something called an unmanaged policy, well, anything that you set up there, the user can reverse the setting. So, for example, I could map a drive letter to the user, and then the user could just delete the drive mapping if they want. Usually the UI is not grayed out. It might be unchecked or deselected if it's a checkbox type of an item, but they still have the ability to go back and recheck it or change that UI. Also, let's take a look at when policies are applied. Well, they're applied at the startup for the computer configuration policies, log on for user, and then again, remember the refresh at 90 to 120 minutes. The preferences are applied, and then they're also refreshed. They're applied in the same way, and they're refreshed, but there is also an option on a common settings item to not reapply. This means that I could remove a setting, and then when the policy refreshes again, it will never reapply it. Okay, this is kind of useful if you have a suggestion for the user, for example. Maybe you want to suggest that they have a certain shortcut on their desktop. Well, if they decide to delete that shortcut and you have the setting do not reapply, that shortcut will never reappear. Otherwise, it could still reapply when a refreshing of the policy takes place. Also, there's removing the policy. When you do that, it will revert back to the operating system default or to whatever other policies higher up the hierarchy will apply. Okay, with preferences, once you set a setting on there, if you were to just delete the policy, it does what we call tattooing the registry. That means that it'll stay there forever until you either go in and manually remove it from the registry, which could be a little painful as you imagine, or until you reapply a new policy that reverts that previous setting. So if you disabled something using a preference and you deleted the policy, in order to make it back the way it was, you'd have to go in and create a new preference and enable that same item. Also, if these are two in conflict, because there are some of the settings that are the same in policies and preferences, and it's just a matter of whichever one you want to use to make the change, well, the policy will always take precedence over a preference. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind as well in terms of that order of inheritance or scope of management. Also, preferences are not available for local group policy objects, whereas we saw that the policies, we definitely had those. These preferences, what are they used for? Well, they're very often useful for desktop icons or shortcuts, so that you want to make something easily accessible to a user. Maybe there's an application that accounting uses every day. Well, you could put the shortcut for that application directly on their desktop for easy accessibility if you wanted to. Also, maybe you want to put a URL on the desktop or a default home page. You could configure that as well. You can put a new item on the right-click fly out menu where it gives you the send to item. Oh, I just right-clicked, but I forgot I was in Photoshop, so that's what it gives me. But you know how there's normally a menu item where you right-click on it and it gives you a send to. You can do it for drive mappings. You can copy files. Maybe there's a file on the file server. You can use this to copy that file over to the client computers. You can also update the files if there's a change to them, or if you no longer need the file on the client side, you could then delete that file. So let's go ahead and take a look at a policy here. Now I've got one linked here to the Tucson users, but as you can tell here, it's grayed out. You can see that's kind of dimmed out right there. Well, as a result of that, we're not going to see it take effect when I go to this computer here and log on. So let me connect real quick here to Tucson user after I enter in the password. And then now we see that we have our start and we go to our desktop. Well, this is just the normal stuff. This has all the policies that we're applying before. There's nothing on the desktop. Notice also that if I wanted to, I could access, the DVD drive. I've got one drive mapping. Okay, so bearing all of that in mind, let's take a look at what happens if I go back here now and I log off on that other machine, which I'll do offline here, and then I re-link this preference. And let's take a look at what the preferences are. First of all, I've got a drive mapping that I created here, and I'm kind of going through this quickly because it's not specifically on the exam, but it's still important. But you just enter in a UNC path, for example, to a drive mapping that you want. I also choose to reconnect this so that this drive mapping will occur every time the user logs on. You can also label this as something else if you want to, you know, server shared file or something like that. And then I could give it a drive letter, and you can give it a whatever drive letter you want to. Okay, so that's an example of how that is. Oh, the other thing I wanted to show you was this item: apply once and do not reapply. Okay, that means that if the user deletes the drive mapping, then it will never apply again. But if I clear that, then every time policy refreshes, it'll still take effect. Also, it's well beyond our scope right now, but in the item level targeting item, you can specify a great many criteria, which is very useful. Maybe you are trying to work with only a specific domain, or maybe you want to work with only a specific IP address range. Well, in addition to the order of inheritance or the scope of management that appears from site, domain, and organizational unit, you can also say only apply it to this organizational unit if the client computers also have a specific IP address range, or there's a security group membership, or a specific time of day you want it to apply. So there's all different kinds of things that you can get a great deal of flexibility there with. I'm not going to really address that right now, though. And then we also have maybe shortcuts. Here you can see I created a shortcut, again, to a specific website, which I won't say too much about which website that is. Anyway, we could update that. We could also create that if we wanted to, you know, whichever way we want to go. And it's a URL that appears on the desktop. Notice we can also do a shell object or a file system object, like if we wanted a shortcut to calc.exe, for example. Then we specify the target URL and so on. We could put a shortcut if we wanted to. And for the icon, you can just specify whichever icon you want. Okay, I just specified a specific one that we'll see here in a little bit. Other things we can do are to work with specific devices. Maybe in a specific organization, we don't want the users to work with their CD-ROM. Maybe it's a CD burner that they could burn files to it and take them out of the office. It's a security vulnerability or something like this. Or maybe they're just playing music through the CD all day or watching movies at work. So we might want to disable that. What we can do is to choose to not use the device or use it, but in this case, disable. And then we specify what kind of a device class, and we click on this little ... over here, and we specify DVD or CD-ROM drives. Okay, so that's another thing that we can do, which I've already taken care of. So then here you can see I've logged back onto this computer as Tucson User 01, and we have a shortcut on the desktop, which of course points to our specific URL that we identified in the preference. Okay, so there's a specific URL. Okay, then once we've done that, we can also go take a look at what else did we do? A file drive mapping. Okay, so if we go to our drive mapping here, we see that there's our drive mapping, and that takes us to that drive, and we assigned a drive letter R. Notice that we're not allowing a CD or a DVD-ROM drive, so it's not available here either. So this is pretty powerful stuff that you can get in all of this, and I do recommend that you go through it, but be very careful with these, as with any of the policies as well, and test them out and experiment with them, because they're very far-reaching and powerful, and you wouldn't want to do any damage. Now let's also take a look at something called starter GPOs. These are very useful for commonly desired settings that we think other people in our organization, other administrators, might want to use. They're not necessarily required. We can create what we call a starter GPO with pre-configured or canned settings, so to speak, that we think other administrators will be interested in, but they can always reverse those settings or disable them if they want to. These are for administrative templates only. It's not for security settings, for example. It's not for preferences. It's only for the administrative templates under policies. And in order to do this, you have to, first of all, create a folder. And there's a UI for that, which I'll show you here shortly. When you do that, it includes a couple of canned starter policies relating to securing client workstations. These are often used for various types of roles. So I might have various types of servers. Maybe my file servers have specific requirements on them that I want to configure. Well, I could do that using certain administrative templates and determine what settings I want there. For laptops, maybe I have, again, certain kinds of settings that I want. For example, maybe I want them to dial out a VPN anytime they connect to the internet or something like that. For desktop computers, maybe I want them to not change their wallpaper. Or for any other kind of a security-sensitive item. I might want to be able to make just security-sensitive settings relating to those computers. Also, you can export these to a cabinet file, which is just a highly compressed file similar to a zip file if you've ever heard of those. And it's just Microsoft's version of a compressed file, and then you could take that cabinet file and take it to another part of your organization, which might not be part of your purview, but other administrators in that division want that same set of policies. Well, you could certainly do that. Let me show you how these starter policies work, and I'm just going to go ahead and get them configured, but we're not going to really do much more than that because really it's the same policies we've already looked at. It's just that we can set them up as starter policies. So first thing we do is we go to Starter GPOs. We create the Starter GPOs folder. And notice that, like I said earlier, we have a couple. Actually, there's more than a couple there, isn't there? But there's several different settings that we can configure. Notice that several of these are for specific operating systems, so bear that in mind. By the way, you might want to know what the abbreviations are. EC is for Enterprise Clients, just kind of a corporate client computer. SSLF is Specialized Security Limited Functionality. So if you really wanted to lock those machines down a little bit more. If we wanted to go to the computer settings, for example, we could go into this, and you don't really edit these directly. However, what you can do is to create a new GPO from the starter GPO, and I could call this Vista EC test, just because I'm not really going to work with it for the time being. But now I can go into my Vista EC test, click on Edit, and I could go through there and look at all the settings. Or, more likely, what would be more useful to us is I could go to my Vista EC test and actually look at the settings this way. And then here it will show me under Policies my various security settings. So, for example, here we see that it's actually got various firewall settings that are either configured or not configured, depending on what domain profile I'm in and so forth. We will be taking a look more at firewall settings and group policy in a future nugget, so I'm not going to elaborate on this for the time being. And then the other way that you can create these is very similar to how you create a new GPO. It's just that when you go into it, let's just say, I had something for Phoenix laptops that I wanted to create. I could create a GPO in this domain and link it here, and then notice that there's a starter GPO item here where I could say, Windows Vista EC computer or EC user, whichever way I wanted to go. I guess this is a computer item, so I choose computer, and then click OK, and then now you would have it. Of course, I didn't really name the GPO, but you get the idea there of how all of that works, okay? So that's a very powerful way to get group policy objects configured and ready to go out of the box for other administrators who might want to work with very similar settings. In this nugget, we talked about group policy. This was part 3 where we discussed the scope of management. Remember, it's site, domain, organizational unit is the general flow of the scope of management. And you also have to understand that policies are cumulative unless they're overridden by another policy further down the hierarchy. The last one read wins. And remember, computer policies override user policies if there's ever a conflict there. Also, we see policies and preferences in this particular nugget. This is where we looked at the differences between the two. And remember that preferences open up a whole new world of power for you in terms of what you can configure, but they also are kind of different in how they apply. For example, when you remove them, they may persist and tattoo the registry, whereas a policy will just go back to the default or whatever the previous policies apply. Also, we looked at starter GPOs. This is a great way to set up security settings, for example, on kind of a canned set of settings that you can then copy and then modify as you need to for your own purposes. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.